Hey, what's going on there, guys? In this video, we're just going to be converting this full video of this guy mixing this drink together into this cool eye-catching cinemagraph animation, which could be used for something like a classy bar ad on Instagram, all from using Photomotion Glacier. The challenge here will be creating our mask and stabilizing the footage to give us this continual stirring effect, and we'll be doing that later on down the line. But first, let's just boot up Photomotion Glacier and get started. The first step, of course, is to jump into this Photomotion X folder to access all of our projections. The next step is, of course, to double click on this Photomotion Glacier folder, and when inside, we'll just double click on Glacier in order to get started. Bear in mind, After Effects may take a moment or two in order to load. And now, of course, we're inside Photomotion Glacier, and that's without any need to install any plugins or applications. We just, of course, need the project files and we're good to go. So with that done, let's just double click on this Start Glacier button over here on the main viewport. When we reach the main dashboard, we'll need to double click on this Add Video button, as that's of course the first step to this animation. Next, we'll have this second button also called Add Video, which we'll of course also need to double click on too, which will bring us into this blank composition. What we'll want to do is bring in our video into this blank composition. So let's just drag and drop it in from the desktop now, and we'll just drag it onto our project tab. By doing so, we'll see this new file appear within our project tab, of course, and that is the video that we've imported in. Now, unlike other projections, if we drag and drop that new file into our composition, you can see there are no parent layers, and that's because, as well as using video files, Glacier works kind of differently. So there are a number of different steps to this projection, in contrast to anything else like Parallax, Horizon, Portrait, or even Mirage. So the first step is, of course, just to make the video fit within the viewport. So we'll just hit S on the keyboard with this layer selected, and that will just bring up all the scaling attributes over here. Currently, it's setting at 100, so we might need to bump that up to something like 200 plus, maybe 1 or 2, in order to give us some leeway when we get to motion tracking footage. 202 is a good amount in this occasion. And the reason why we're kind of overshooting the scale here is just to make life that much more easier when we get to motion tracking this video. However, we'll get to that later on within the workflow. Next, we'll need to decide whereabouts our loop will start and end. At the bottom of the screen, you can see that there is quite a lot in terms of our video clip duration, and for Glacier, we only really need a very small part of that video clip itself. So let's just hit play and find the right part. As you can see, the bartender here switches hands at that point, disrupting the stirring motion. So at the very least, we need a section just before that action. So let's just bring our playhead slightly back to a point where that stirring motion with that hand starts, and we need to cut out the section before he changes hands. And of course, we'll want to make sure that we get one solid rotation of this stirrer as well. Around here is perfect, as that hand in the background is perfectly stationary where it is, and now what we need to do is move our playhead a few frames in front to a point where the stirrer in the glass mixer is roughly the same place as it was when we made our first cut. This isn't a requirement, by the way, as we can use the animation settings if it's slightly off, but it's just for safety concerns so that we at least have one full rotation within our animation. This is decent here, and again, we don't see any elements near the action, like this refracted hand isn't moving really, say for example. So let's just cut this clip from here. So this little segment from this whole video clip is what we'll be using to achieve the cinemagraph, of course. With that established, let's just delete the top and bottom layers here, as that's essentially just excess footage. What we'll want to do now is just bring this clip to the beginning of the composition here. By the way, if you hold shift while dragging when that clip gets close to the beginning, the end of it of course will snap to the beginning of the composition. Okay, cool, that's all done, it's in place. You can now see here within this clip we only have this movement of the stirrer here. Let's just see if we can extend this track any further along, and we might be able to even get in a couple more frames here. Again, we don't want to include any frames where anything outside of that stirring motion happens around the glass here. So again, if we see any movement from that hand in the background, we know we've gone a little bit too far. Okay, now that's done, let's just zoom out of our timeline and jump into that other add video composition, the one that's basically housing this composition. Now what we want to do is just click on this freeze time button that you can see on the main viewport, which will highlight the working area below. You can also see to the right here we actually have this little preview box, and currently it says video freezed on frame 0, which is a preview that will tell us where our other elements like the bottles, the rest of the bartender and the background will be frozen on. We can change this placement by dragging along this freeze time marker. However, if we wanted a different frame, we'd have to be very careful. If we were to drag this too far along past the duration of what that small clip was that we snipped out earlier, it will give us a black screen here and this error mentioning that the marker is out of the scope of our video length. So just be careful about that if you want to choose a different frame to freeze on. In any case, the freeze frame is probably fine at the very beginning here, so let's just drag it back, of course. You'll also see this green outline appear, which just means that the freeze frame marker is in line with your needle over here. So without any delays, now that that's sorted, let's head back to the main dashboard and continue on setting up our animation. Now the next step with this animation is to set the mask, and this is the part where we'll be telling Photomotion what elements we want frozen in place and which we want moving. So let's just double click on this set mask button over here, and that will get us access into this composition. Since we're not importing a mask in, let's just double click on this draw mask button over here. Once we're in this composition, you'll see not much is currently on show. We have no buttons, there's no UI elements here, and that's because we don't need to fiddle around with any options in this stage. All we need to do is just select this layer down here, then navigate up to the pen tool and just click on it and start drawing the mask, and that's pretty much it. So what we really want to do is just start masking out the glass here and the hand and the stirrer by just clicking over some of these points. And within this section, all we're really doing is telling Photomotion this is the area that we want moving within our cinemagraph. Now the issue here that we have to contend with is the stirrer, as throughout our clip the top and hand position change, and of course we don't want that motion to intersect with our mask, so we'll just put a couple of points here and then move the playhead back again, as we'll see a lot of movement at the top of the stirrer and we just want to make sure that it doesn't intersect. Now if we have to make a couple of adjustments, we have to make a couple of adjustments, that's no problem at all at this stage. We just need to move those mask points just slightly more out the way. Now that we are confident we have the stirrer movement in the mask, it's pretty much smooth sailing from here, as we're not going to see much movement on the rest of these elements like the base of the arm within this selection. And really try not to be too exact with this mask. You can give it a little bit of leeway with some gap between the mask and the element you're masking. It doesn't need to be precise, and of course when dealing with moving elements, it's always best just to give them a little bit more space. Alright, so let's just move our playhead along and double check that nothing is intersecting with the mask. You can see now that on the left side here of the stirrer handle, just up here, it's getting pretty close to that mask, so let's just adjust the mask ever so slightly on the left side. We can now see that the stirrer is easily housed within that mask now. Just be careful when looking at your clip and the masks, and make sure that if there is anything getting too close to that mask, just extend it out a little bit further. Another thing to be careful of, much like when we were choosing which frame we wanted that freeze to originate from, we can easily pass out of that small clip duration, and if we do so, we'll see this grey screen with this error. So just be aware of this, and if you see something like this, just bring your playhead ever so slightly back. Cool, so with our mask sorted, let's get to adding some feathering by just hitting F on the keyboard with that masked layer selected, of course, and that will bring up these feathering attributes. We want to add some feathering here, and we'll bring that up to around 28 pixels. So you might be wondering, why are we adding feathering? We want this masked area to be as subtle as possible. We don't want any giveaways or tells that everything around this selection is a frozen frame, which would make our animation look less immersive. So if you're seeing something jarring on your cinemagraph, like jagged lines where that mask was applied to, what you can do is just add a little bit of feathering, which might solve that problem. In any case, on that note, let's just swap out to the main dashboard and look at how it looks so far. Well, it's okay, although we need to change a couple of things here before continuing, like getting rid of this loop fade here. However, just before getting to fixing those problems, let's just ensure to swap out from the pen tool to the selection tool. So let's just get to fixing up this animation. The first step here, of course, is to select this animation button and then navigate over to effect controls. If you don't see effect controls, by the way, what you'll need to do is just go over to window at the very top here and then select this effect controls. It might have something like settings - animations, depending on what you have selected, but just make sure that effect controls is at the very beginning. And the window should appear just over here to the top left. Next, we'll just navigate over to it and then drag this loop length frames right down just to see how this animation looks without any crossfades between each loop. As you can see when we preview without any crossfades between each loop, the animation looks rather quite jarring and it's kind of stuttering from one loop to another, so it's not really that immersive. So let's add the tiniest amount into this loop here by again going back to that loop frames option within effect controls and then bring it up to something extremely small like 3, which will introduce a very small crossfade between each loop. When we preview it now, you can see that we've removed that jarring effect while still not showing any obvious crossfades within the animation. Now, in case you're curious, that fade is so subtle we won't really be able to perceive it as we're watching this here. However, through the wonders of editing, we can still see that if we were to pause here, you can just about see that crossfade, and it's a split second here, but it's so subtle that no one ever is going to notice that. So in other words, that's perfect. Now with our animation wrapped up and ready to go, let's see about fixing another issue that we're seeing. If you look very carefully, you'll see the mixing glass here shakes ever so slightly. It might seem like a minor imperfection in this case, but it is slightly off-putting. So where is this issue coming from? Well, we'll need to jump into the add video composition in order to show you. Remember the place where we imported in our video and snipped the relevant part of that clip into place. Now, with our needle at the very end of this clip, if we set the end of our working area here and then play it in a loop, if you look at the edges of the frame, you can kind of see that this shot here isn't exactly stable. There's a small amount of camera shake here, and what that is doing is adding some shake to the stirring movement. So what we'll need to do is get rid of this by applying a motion tracker. Just a quick note before applying a motion tracker, just ensure that the scale of your video is slightly larger than that of the composition. Doesn't need to be a huge amount, but depending on how much shake there is, you might need to add more scale than less. Right, so first up, we're going to need to see the tracker panel. So let's just go to Window up here again and then select this tracker option over here. We'll then see this menu appear at the very bottom right, and with this clip selected, we're going to select the Stabilize Motion button here, which will open up these settings just below. We'll leave all of this alone as we just want to click on this rotation over here. This ensures that we track not only the movement from side to side and up and down, but also any rotational movement from that camera shake as well. Now back at the main dashboard, we have these two tracking points. We have tracking point 1 and tracking point 2. 2. What we'll do is move track point 1 to the bottle over here to the left by just selecting the center of it and then moving it over to the top label. You'll kind of notice it magnifies into the tracking area, and we'll want to place it in a point with a high amount of contrast. So between this sort of gold and red area here is perfect. We'll then increase the size of this inner box, and outer box will improve the overall surface area, which will of course improve the amount of tracking data that After Effects can ascertain. Next, we'll do exactly the same with track point 2, except this time we'll place it on the opposite end of the frame, nearer to the bottom, just over here. We want these two to really be on the opposite ends of the frame to get the most accurate tracking data as possible. Okay, so with these 2 points all set up, just make sure that the playhead is at the very beginning of the composition, and then hit this button over here in order to start the tracking process. What that will do is just basically play the clip from where the needle is, and then as that clip plays along, it will basically just calculate all of that tracking data. You can see here that at either one of these track points, there are now a series of little square dot things within the tracking point, which basically indicates that we have tracking information. Next step, again with this video layer selected, it's just going back over to that tracking panel over here and then selecting this apply button here. You'll then see this motion tracker apply options here appear, and for that we just need to ensure that next to apply dimensions it says X and Y. Finally, just hit OK. Now, if all goes to plan, when we get back to the main dashboard, that problem should be gone. And if we preview, we can see that we're no longer seeing that slight shaking within the cinemagraph where the mixer glass is. As said before, if you're dealing with tracking in a different example and you're seeing some black edges around here or something like that, just increase the base footage scale just a tad more, and that should, again, in theory, get rid of that problem. Right, so on to the next step here. Adding particles. We'll first bring our mouse just over here and select this settings button over here to the bottom right under the blue particles tab. Next, we'll go over to Effect Controls and then select this checkbox under Activate Particles, which will activate our particle system. Now, these petals probably aren't the most suitable in this use case, as we'll want something substantially more subtle, so let's get to changing them by using the particle type slider over here. So we'll change them out to these dust particles here, which are really quite subtle and nice. However, they're slightly too prominent within this scene still, so let's make them blend a little bit better with the background. We can do so by just going over to this color corrections tab here and then changing this channel to alpha, and then bring down the highlights of the alpha channel, which will bring down the transparency of the brightest points of the specks. This is much better. It makes the particles that much more subtle and the animation seem more like a vintage bar. Right, and that's the animation more or less sorted out from here. Let's think about exporting it out now. First, we'll want to change the export resolution by clicking on the resolution up here and then navigate over to Effect Controls over here. What we'll want to do is change this export resolution drop down from 1080p to 4K, and then navigate back down to the dashboard and then double click on this export button. When we get into this composition, you'll see a series of numbers at the bottom of the viewport here. And that, of course, is the Photomotion Perfect Cut system. So with Glacier, sometimes a good few loops is best. So let's export out 7 loops, which, as Photomotion Perfect Cut tells us, is 70 frames. So of course, let's go over to the frame count indicator over here. By the way, if this shows timecode instead of frames, just hold Control and then click on it. And then what we'll do is change this 0 to 70. Our time head here will move to the 70 point, and Photomotion Perfect Cut has changed to green and giving us a go for 7 loops. Next, we'll mark the end of our working area here to ensure that we only render out 7 loops, and we'll do one final adjustment here. vignetting. So to do this, we'll just click on the settings button over here, then go over to effect controls, and then we'll just navigate next to this vignetting over here. We'll ramp this up to something like 65 to really hone in the attention of the viewer to the mixer looping in and out at the center of the frame. Now let's just preview this one last time. Looking really good here, quite confident that this is going to be fairly distracting in a good way. So let's just export this out now by going up here to composition, then selecting this add to render queue, which will bring our working area into the After Effects render engine. Now once that's in there, we'll want to do a few tweaks here. So let's just click on the lossless down here and change the format settings. When you see this output settings menu appear, we'll want to change the format from AVI to QuickTime. And when we're happy, we'll hit OK, and then we'll change this output location by clicking on this blue not yet specified text here. And then of course, once this file explorer tab opens up, we'll save it in a convenient place for us. In this example, we'll just choose the desktop. Finally, we'll just hit render here to begin the rendering process. Of course, to bring that into social media, we'll need to re-render that end result using Adobe Media Encoder. So of course, once that's complete, we'll just boot that up. So of course, once that's done, we'll bring that render from After Effects into Media Encoder and just ensure that the format here is set to H.264 and the final output location is of course to our liking. Last thing to do is just of course render. And there we go, that's this animation concluded, and we have this really decent vintage-like cinematograph of this bartender mixing drinks. Don't forget, if you're interested, we have plenty of other classes on different projections, so if you're interested, feel free to check those out.